I want to tell you about a couple who sold their truck to pay for my coaching. Now, they weren't doing it because they had nothing else to spend money on. They did it because they'd already spent $40,000 on another program and got nowhere. Their names, let's call them Don and Nat. Nat was a Navy corpsman. Don was a Marine. They heard me speak on a webinar and reached out afterward and decided they were going to make this work. 2 years later, they raised over $350,000 on their first multifamily deal. Today, they're asset managers on multiple properties. See, but that sentence makes it sound simpler than it was. There was a point in the middle of those 2 years where Don had to take a part-time job just to keep cash coming in. There were moments where quitting would have been the easier choice, and they didn't quit. And in this video, I'm going to tell you exactly what we worked on together and why those 2 years changed everything for them. My name is Nitsan Mosery. I've been in multifamily real estate for over 15 years. My team and I, we manage over $150 million in assets under management. I've coached many people, many investors through this process, I should say. People at every level, with every kind of background. Nat and Don are one of the stories I'm most proud of. Not because of the numbers, although the numbers are real, but because of what they went through to get there. And because they are a couple, which adds another layer of complexity that most coaching programs completely ignore. See, working together as a couple is its own skill, and we'll get into that by the end of this video. You're going to understand why most people who try to raise capital fail at networking. Not because they're bad at it, but because they're making one specific mistake without realizing it. You're also going to know how to build the deal analysis skills that give you the confidence and credibility to talk to anyone about multifamily, including investors who've been in the business longer than you have, and how to raise capital as a complete beginner by leveraging the track record of the people already in your corner, even if you've never done a deal in your life. So Nat and Don came to me. They had two things most people don't. They had military discipline and they had drive. What they didn't have was a system that actually worked. They spent $40,000 on a program before finding me. $40,000. And they weren't in a bad financial position because of it. They were in a worse position. Not just because of the money, because they'd spent time and energy on an approach that didn't move them forward. And that kind of frustration gets inside your head. See, when they reached out to me, they were ready to commit, and they proved it immediately. Don went and sold his truck to pay for coaching. I want to be clear about what that means. That's not someone who's interested in multifamily. That's someone who's decided. And that decision, before we'd done a single session together, told me a lot about who they were. One of the first things I had to address with Nat and Don had nothing to do with real estate. It was the fact that they were a couple trying to run a business together. And here's what I've seen happen with couples who work together. The personal life rolls into the business, and the business rolls into the personal. There are no clear boundaries. A disagreement about a deal becomes a disagreement about a relationship. A stressful deal timeline bleeds into dinner, and suddenly the business is affecting everything. So the first thing we did, we worked on setting clear roles and clear lanes early. Not because they didn't trust each other, because without those lanes, even the most aligned couples start pulling in different directions. And what came out of that work was something important. Nat and Don didn't have the same strengths, and they didn't need to. See, Nat was a natural relationship builder. And Dan was more analytical. And once we recognized that, we could stop trying to make them do the same things and start building on what each of them was actually good at. See, this matters for anyone watching. If you're building a multifamily business with a partner, a spouse, a team, the first question to answer is who is doing what, not we're both doing everything. That's the fast track to nobody doing anything well. So here's what I noticed when I started working with Nat and Don. The program they'd spent $40,000 on had given them information, a lot of it, frameworks, terminology, concepts. What it hadn't given them was behavioral change. Nat knew intellectually how networking was supposed to work. She could explain it, but the moment she was in a room with a potential investor, she defaulted to her old pattern. She'd go straight for the ask. Don could tell you what an underwriting model was supposed to do, but when it came to actually sitting down with a real deal, the confidence wasn't there. Information doesn't change behavior. Implementation does. And that's what we had to build. There are three things I worked on with Nat and Don over those 2 years. The first was what many call mental theater. This was Natalie's work, learning how to build real relationships with investors instead of immediately going for the ask. And we'll get into exactly what that is and how it works. The second was deal fluency. This was primarily Daniel's work, building the analytical skills to run numbers, read financial statements, and understand a deal well enough to talk about it confidently with anyone. And the third is what we call authority transfer. This was the approach that got them to $350,000 raised. It's how you raise capital when you have no track record. And it's something every new investor can use. So let's break them down. Nat is a great person. She's smart, energetic, genuine, and she had every quality you'd want in a capital raiser. But she had one habit that was quietly undermining everything. It was undermining everything she was trying to build. And every time she was at a networking event, every single time within the first few minutes of meeting someone, she'd pivot to the ask. Are you looking to invest? Here's what we have. Here's the opportunity. And I kept telling her, don't go for the jugular. She wasn't doing it to be pushy. She was doing it because she was excited, because she genuinely believed in what she was building, and because she'd been told to get out there and talk to investors. So she was talking to investors, but there's a difference between talking to investors and building investor relationships. And that difference is everything in capital raising. Here's the thing about asking someone for money when you've just met them. Even if the deal is real, even if the opportunity is legitimate, the trust hasn't been established. The answer is always going to be no, or at best, a polite, I'll think about it. And that goes nowhere. See, capital isn't raised at the moment you ask. It's raised all the moments that came before it. See, that's the principle that Nat had to internalize. And it required more than just telling her to change her behavior. It required retraining how she thought about the entire interaction. See, the mental theater is a visualization practice. And before I explain it, I want to say something about visualization, because a lot of people hear that word and think it's motivational fluff. It's not. It's neuroscience. Your subconscious mind does not reliably distinguish between something you've actually experienced and something you vividly and fully imagined. And this is documented. It's why athletes visualize their performance before competing. It's why surgeons mentally walk through a procedure before picking up a scalpel. See, the mental theater takes that principle and applies it to networking. And here's how it works. Before Natalie went to any networking event, we would sit down, sometimes just the two of us, sometimes the three of us, and walk through the entire event in detail, not at surface level, in full sensory detail. What does the room look like when she walks in? What's the energy? Who is she likely to meet? What questions is she going to ask? What answers is she going to receive? Not might receive, but is going to receive. Cut. See, what answers is she going to receive? Not might receive, but is going to receive. Because she's thought through the range of responses in advance. How does she feel in the room? What does her body language communicate? What does she do when she gets nervous? What does she say when the conversation starts to naturally move towards real estate? We did this repeatedly over and over until the networking event she was going to wasn't a new experience anymore. It was a rerun of something she'd already lived. It was a rerun that she'd already lived through in her mind dozens of times. See, the change wasn't immediately. Behavioral patterns that are deeply ingrained don't disappear after one visualization session. But over time, something shifted. Nat started arriving at networking events with a different posture. Not the posture of someone who needed something from the room, the posture of someone who was genuinely curious about the people in it. She started asking questions, real ones, not as a setup for a pitch, but because she was actually interested in who people were and what they were working on. She stopped going for the jugular. And what happened, and this is the thing that surprises people, is that the conversation that happened as a result were actually better for capital raising than anything she'd done before. because people started leaving those conversations having connected with Natalie and not having been pitched by her. See, that distinction is the difference between chasing investors and attracting them. Now, I want to talk about deal analysis a little differently than most people do, because I think there's a framing problem with how it gets taught. Most programs present underwriting as a technical skill. Learn the formulas, understand the ratios, run the model correctly. And those things matter. Don't get me wrong. I'm not dismissing them. But for someone like Don, someone who was newer to real estate and was trying to build credibility alongside the technical skills, deal analysis wasn't primarily a math problem. It was a confidence problem. Because here's what happens when you don't have deal fluency. You walk into conversations with investors and you can't speak to the numbers. You can't speak to the numbers without any authority or with any authority. Someone asks you about the cap rate on the deal and you hesitate. Someone asks you about the debt coverage ratio and you deflect. And in that moment, the person you're talking to, even if they like you, even if they want to trust you, has a doubt. See, deal fluency isn't just the ability to run numbers. It's the ability to speak about a deal in a way that builds confidence in the people listening to you. See, that's what we built with Don. Don and I went through deal analysis extensively, not once, repeatedly over months. We started with the fundamentals, how to read a financial statement, what the income line is actually telling you versus what it looks like on the surface, how to spot anomalies in the T12. The trailing 12-month income and expense statement, okay? That might signal a problem the seller doesn't want you to find. Then we went deeper into the rent rolls. How to read them, how to identify where the property is at, what market rent versus where it's under rented, and critically, how to find actual market rent, which is harder than most people think. Comparable rents in the right submarket, in the right condition class, with the right amenity set, that's where the real analysis lives. We worked through my financial model, walked through it deal by deal, not hypothetically, on real packages that brokers were sending, real properties with real numbers, real sellers, real market conditions. And we talked about what makes a deal worth pursuing versus what makes it worth walking away from. My job is to teach you to say no. Because in this business, knowing when to walk away is just as valuable as knowing how to close. So here's what happened to Don and his deal fluency and how it grew. He started arriving at investor conversations differently, not as someone who needed to prove himself, as someone who understood what he was talking about. When an investor asked a question about a deal, Daniel had an answer. When someone pushed back on an assumption in the underwriting, he could explain it. That shift from someone learning about real estate to someone who could speak about it with authority is not small. It's the difference between a conversation that builds trust and one that quietly erodes it. Deal fluency is a confidence multiplier. And once you have it, everything else in this business works better. So here's the question I hear from almost every new investor who wants to raise capital. Why would anyone trust me with their money when I haven't done a deal yet? And that's a fair question. And most programs either ignore it or give you a vague answer about building relationships over time. That's true, but it's not the entire answer. And for Nat and Don, who needed to start raising capital while they were still building their track record, that answer wasn't enough. Here's what I tell every student that's in this position. You don't have to be the star of the show. When Nat and Don were talking to potential investors, they were starting from zero. No deals closed. No track record. No performance history. Cut. We've closed deals across multiple states and asset classes. So I told them, use that. Not deceptively, transparently, but lead with it. And I do this today, even though I'm a sponsor. When I'm doing bigger deals, I bring in other sponsors, and this is how we frame it. So the framing I gave them was simple. We're working with a sponsor who's been in multifamily for over 15 years, has raised close to $100 million in equity, and has a team that has been through multiple market cycles. I'm the one who's doing the day-to-day work on identifying, evaluating the deals, but when we bring something forward, it goes through a team that has done this hundreds of times or multiple times. That framing does several things at once. First of all, it's honest. Nat and Don were working with an experienced sponsor. That was true. It's credible. The credibility attached to the deal is real. Investors aren't being asked to trust two people with no experience. They're being asked to trust an experienced team with Nat and Don as the relationship interface. And it takes the pressure off. Instead of Nat and Don needing to be the most experienced people in the room, they only needed to be trustworthy enough for the investor to take the next step, which was a conversation with someone who had the full track record. See, the authority transfer works because of how trust is actually built in investing. Investors don't put money into deals. They put money into people. And when the people directly in front of them are new, what they're evaluating is, are these people connected to someone I can trust or something that I can trust? The answer, when it's Nat and Don backed by an experienced sponsor, is yes. Now, here's the important caveat. This approach is a bridge. It's not a destination. You use it to build your first track record. Once you've raised capital, participated in deals, and started building your own story, you start leading with that. The borrowed credibility becomes the backstory, and your own results become the headline. Nat and Don understood this. They weren't using my track record as a permanent crutch. They were using it to open doors while they built their own record behind those doors. And that's exactly what it's for. So I want to give you the honest version of what Nat and Don's 2 years actually looked like. Not because I want to discourage anyone, because I think it's the most useful thing I can tell you. There was a point, more than one point actually, where they could have quit, where the easy choice would have been to step back and go back to what they knew and accept that multifamily wasn't going to happen right now. And that's real. That's what building this business sometimes looks like. And I told them the same thing I tell everyone I work with when it gets hard. Don't ever quit. Because the minute you quit, you lose. It doesn't matter if it takes you 5 years or 10 years. You keep going. And they kept going. And the thing about perseverance is that it doesn't just build a business. It builds something in you that the business itself eventually reflects back. Nat's networking changed because she changed. Don's deal confidence, it grew because he kept doing the reps, even when it was uncomfortable. The skills we worked on weren't acquired in a session or a month. They were built through 2 years of consistent work. That's the timeline most programs don't show you. And it's the one you need to be honest with yourself about. So here's how to take what Nat and Don built and apply it to where you are right now. If you're working on building investor relationships, start with the mental theater. Before your next networking event, sit down and walk through the entire thing in your head. Not in a vague motivational way, in full detail. Who's in the room? What questions you're going to ask? What answers you might receive? How you're going to respond? Where the conversation naturally goes when real estate comes up and where it doesn't need to go yet. Practice not going for the jugular and make the goal of every first conversation to learn something about the other person. That's it. Not to pitch, not to ask, just to understand who they are and what they care about. If you're working on deal analysis, start running numbers. Even if you're not close to buying anything. Broker packages are freely available. Download them. Walk through the entire T12. Try to find the market rent on your own before looking at what the seller says it is. Compare your analysis to what the broker is claiming. Over time, your eye develops, and if you're raising capital right now with no track record, use the authority transfer. Identify who in your ecosystem has the credibility you don't have yet. And be honest and transparent about that relationship when you're talking to investors. You're not pretending to have experience you don't have. You are accurately representing the team behind the deal. So let me give you the full picture. Nat and Don came to me having spent $40,000 on a program that gave them information without implementation. They sold their truck to pay for a different approach. They worked with me for 2 years, through setbacks, through a part-time job, through moments where the easier path was to step back. They raised over $350,000 on their first multifamily deal. Today they have partnerships, they have projects, they are asset managers on multiple properties. But the number that matters most to me isn't the $350,000. It's the fact that they built something real, not a deal they stumbled into. A real capability, the networking skills, the deal fluency, the relationship that is theirs, that goes with them. That builds over time. That's what coaching is supposed to produce. Not a transaction, a transformation. I've worked with a lot of people who have the same starting point. What separated them wasn't talent or luck. It was 2 things. First, they committed to the work even when it was uncomfortable. The mental theater felt strange at first. Running numbers on deals they weren't buying felt abstract. The authority required them to have conversations they weren't fully confident about. They did all of it anyway. Second, they didn't try to shortcut time. They accepted that 2 years of consistent work was the price of the foundation they were building, and they paid it. Most people who fail in this space aren't failing because they lack ability. They're failing because they're trying to get the result without going through the process. Nat and Don went through the process, and the results reflect that. I think about the $40,000 Nat and Don spent before they came to me, because I think it illustrates something important. That program gave them content, conceptual frameworks, a general education about how multifamily works. What it didn't give them was the work on how Nat shows up in a room, the behavioral practice that changes the actual output, the consistent deal analysis reps that build confidence over time, and the specific strategy for raising capital before you have a track record to point to. The gap between knowing how something works and actually being able to do it is a skills gap. And skills gaps get closed through implementation and not through more information. And that's the distinction. And it's the reason I built my coaching the way I built it. So let me bring this together. The 3 things I built with Nat and Dan, and the 3 things that got them from $40,000 wasted on the wrong program to $350,000 raised on their first deals were: Pillar 1, the mental theater. Learning to show up in networking events, environments differently. Building the behavioral pattern that attracts investors instead of pushing them away. Pillar number 2, deal fluency. Building the analytical skills to run numbers and on a real deal well enough to talk about it with authority, not just understanding it, being able to hold a conversation about it that builds confidence. And then pillar number 3, the authority transfer. Raising capital as a beginner by accurately and transparently leveraging the track record of the experienced team behind the deal, using borrowed credibility to build your own. Here's what I want you to take away from Nat and Don's story. The gap between where you are and where you want to be is a skills gap, not a luck gap. A skills gap can be built, but they are built through consistent work over time and not through watching videos or reading books, through doing the reps, making the calls, sitting down with the deals, and going to the networking events even when you're not sure, or even when you're sure that you're not ready. If Nat and Don's story sounds like where you are, if you've spent money on education that didn't move you forward, if you know you want to build but you're not sure how to bridge the gap, I want to have a conversation with you. Inside the Multifamily Accelerator, this is exactly what we work on. Not more information, implementation, the networking skills, the deal analysis, the capital raising strategy, built the same way I built with Nat and Don. The link is in the description below. And if this video gave you something useful, share it with someone who's trying to figure this out. You might be surprised how many people in your world are sitting on the same frustration Nat and Don had and have no idea that there's a different way. So I'll see you in the next video.